history. In 1859, an enslaved woman threw a party so expensive that the richest slave owners in America couldn't stop talking about it. Ice sculptures in Mississippi summer heat, wine shipped from France, dishes that would make modern Michelin chefs jealous. But here's the part that doesn't make sense. The woman organizing all of this, she was enslaved. She owned nothing. She had no rights. She could be sold at any moment. So how does someone with zero legal power pull off the most talked about feast in one of America's richest towns? And why did this one dinner become a legend that people are still talking about over 150 years later? Her name was Clara, and what she did that night challenged everything people thought they knew about power, slavery, and who gets remembered by history. Here's what you're about to find out: who Clara really was, and how she got her reputation in the first place. Why Natchez, Mississippi was the weirdest, richest, most messed up place in America. What actually happened at this legendary feast that made it so special, and most important, what this all really meant. Because this wasn't just about food. This was about power, resistance, and a woman finding a way to shine in a system designed to crush her. Let's start with the place that made all this possible. Natchez, Mississippi in the 1850s was unlike anywhere else in America. Picture this: by 1860, this one town had more millionaires per person than New York City. More than Boston, more than anywhere else in the entire country. We're talking about people so rich, they'd make modern billionaires look twice. But here's what made that wealth possible: cotton, and enslaved people forced to pick it. Natchez sat right on the Mississippi River, which meant cotton could be shipped anywhere. And cotton in the 1850s was basically liquid gold. One plantation could produce thousands of bales a year. At peak prices, that's millions of dollars in today's money, every single year. But that money came from human beings working from sunrise to sunset, whipped if they slowed down, sold away from their families if their owner needed cash. So you had this bizarre contradiction. The richest people in America living in massive mansions with crystal chandeliers and imported furniture, while the people who actually created that wealth lived in shacks and owned nothing. And in this world of crazy extremes, there was one way enslaved people could gain a tiny bit of influence: food. See, these rich plantation owners were obsessed with showing off their wealth, and one of the best ways to do that was throwing elaborate dinners. If you could serve better food than your neighbor, you just won a social battle. And to serve incredible food, you needed an incredible cook. That's where Clara comes in. Here's the frustrating part about telling Clara's story: we don't have much. Enslaved people weren't allowed to write their own stories. Most couldn't read or write because teaching them was illegal. And white people sure weren't writing detailed biographies about black cooks. So what we know about Clara comes from fragments, mentions in white people's diaries and letters, oral histories passed down through generations, court records, receipts for food purchases. But here's what we can piece together. Clara was enslaved and working as a cook, probably in one of Natchez's wealthy households. And she was good. Not just good, legendary. The kind of cook that people talked about. In a world where dinner parties were how you showed off your status, having Clara in your kitchen was like having a secret weapon. She knew French cooking techniques. She could work with ingredients most cooks had never seen. She understood how to create dishes that would make wealthy guests lose their minds. And here's the thing about being that good at something in the 1850s South. It gave you a weird kind of power. You were still enslaved. You could still be sold, beaten, or killed at any moment. But your owner also needed you. They relied on you to maintain their social status. That created a tiny crack in the system, a small space where Clara could operate with some freedom. And Clara was about to use that space to do something nobody expected. The feast that would become legendary didn't just happen. Clara spent weeks, maybe months, planning it. We're not entirely sure who organized it or why. Some accounts say it was Clara's owner showing off. Others suggest Clara herself proposed it, knowing she could pull off something spectacular. Either way, once the decision was made, Clara took charge. She needed ingredients that couldn't be found in Mississippi: wine from France, oysters from the Gulf, exotic spices, sugar and flour by the barrel. Her owner had to spend a fortune. We're talking thousands of dollars in 1859 money. That's like dropping 100,000 or more today on a single party. But Clara wasn't just planning food, she was planning theater. She directed other enslaved workers in the household, organized the service, planned the timing so each course came out perfectly. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. Clara had to do all this while still being enslaved herself. She couldn't leave the property without permission. She couldn't read recipe books because it was illegal to teach her to read. She had no formal culinary training. Everything she knew, she'd learned by watching, listening, and experimenting in whatever spare moments she could steal. And now she was about to put on a show that would make Natchez' richest families talk for years. Now here's what I want to know. If you had a skill that gave you some small amount of power in an otherwise powerless situation, would you use it to show off and demand respect? Or would you keep your head down and stay safe? Because Clara made a choice that night that was risky. Drop a comment and let me know what you think you would have done. The night of the feast arrived, and from the moment guests walked in, they knew this was something different. The table stretched the length of the room, covered in white linen so fine it probably cost more than most people's houses. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. Silver serving pieces gleamed. Flower arrangements imported from who knows where filled the air with perfume. But the real show was the food. Clara didn't just cook dinner. She created an experience with course after course after course. First came the oysters, fresh from the Gulf, served on ice. And remember, this is Mississippi in late summer. Ice was basically magic. Then soups, multiple types. Turtle soup, which was a delicacy rich people loved. Consommé so clear you could see through it. Next came fish courses. Whole fish decorated with sauces and garnishes that looked almost too beautiful to eat. Then the main meats: roasted turkey, glazed ham, beef so tender it fell apart with a fork. Game birds that had been hunted specifically for this dinner. Between courses, there were palate cleansers. Little sorbets to refresh your taste buds before the next round. And through it all, wine. Different wines for different courses: red, white, champagne. Bottles that had been shipped across the ocean. The desserts alone would have been enough for a normal fancy dinner. Cakes, puddings, tarts, candied fruits, everything sweet and decadent you could imagine. And presiding over this entire production, making sure every plate went out perfect, was Clara. She never sat at that table. She wasn't a guest. She was working, directing other enslaved workers, making sure everything was flawless. But every person in that dining room knew this wasn't the owner's achievement. This was Clara's. Guests reportedly couldn't stop talking about it. Some were amazed, others were uncomfortable. Because seeing an enslaved woman demonstrate this level of skill, this level of mastery, this level of power, even in a kitchen, didn't fit with what they wanted to believe about slavery. They wanted to think enslaved people were less capable, less intelligent, less human. Clara's feast made that lie impossible to maintain. So let's talk about the impossible situation Clara was in. She was enslaved. That means she had zero legal rights. She couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't leave without permission, could be sold at any moment, could be beaten or killed with no legal consequences for her owner. And yet, on this one night, she commanded a room full of the richest, most powerful people in Mississippi. How is that possible? The answer is that slavery was full of these weird contradictions. The system tried to dehumanize enslaved people completely, but it also relied on their skills, intelligence, and labor. Rich white families trusted enslaved people to raise their children, to cook their food, to manage their households, to know intimate details of their lives. That created these strange power dynamics where enslaved people sometimes knew more and could do more than their owners. Clara wasn't unique in using culinary skill as leverage. In Charleston, South Carolina, there were famous black cooks who essentially ran the city's food scene. In New Orleans, enslaved and free, black cooks created what would become Creole cuisine, mixing African, French, and Spanish techniques in ways white cooks couldn't match. These cooks understood something important. In a world that tried to take everything from them, skill was something that couldn't be easily stolen or destroyed. You could sell a cook to someone else, but you couldn't make her forget how to cook. You could beat someone, but you couldn't beat the knowledge out of their head. So Clara's feast wasn't just showing off. It was a statement. It was saying, I am brilliant, I am capable, I am powerful, and you can't take that away from me, no matter what you do. The feast became the talk of Natchez. People who weren't even there heard about it and wanted details. Some guests praised it as the finest dinner they'd ever experienced. They went home and told everyone about the incredible food, the perfect service, the lavish presentation. But other people were disturbed. They didn't like seeing an enslaved woman getting this much attention and praise. There were whispers that it was inappropriate, that Clara was getting too much credit, that it was dangerous to let enslaved people demonstrate this kind of capability. Because here's what scared them. If Clara could do this, what did that say about slavery as a system? The whole point of slavery was claiming black people were inferior and needed to be controlled. But Clara just threw a dinner party that none of these supposedly superior white people could match. That made people uncomfortable, really uncomfortable. But uncomfortable or not, people couldn't stop talking about it. The story got passed down through families, white and black. Decades later, people in Natchez were still mentioning Clara's feast. It became part of the town's history, this legendary dinner that an enslaved woman pulled off. And that's kind of amazing when you think about it. Most enslaved people's lives went completely unrecorded. History erased them. But Clara did something so remarkable that even a system designed to erase her couldn't make people forget. So what does Clara's feast really mean? Why does it matter now, over 150 years later? First, it's a reminder that enslaved people were full human beings with incredible talents, intelligence, and creativity. The system tried to reduce them to property, to deny their humanity. But they were chefs, artists, craftspeople, thinkers. They had skills that surpassed their oppressors. Second, it shows how people found ways to resist and maintain dignity even in the most oppressive circumstances. Clara couldn't fight back with weapons. She couldn't vote or sue or run away easily. But she could cook a meal so perfect that it forced people to recognize her brilliance. That's a form of resistance. Quiet, strategic, but powerful. Third, Clara's story is part of a bigger picture about black contributions to American culture. Black cooks created so much of what we think of as Southern food, American food, but they rarely got credit for it. White cookbook authors would copy recipes from black cooks without attribution. Restaurants would hire black chefs, but only allow white people to be the public face. Even today, black chefs and food traditions don't always get the recognition they deserve. So telling Clara's story is part of correcting that historical record. It's saying, look at what black people created, achieved, and contributed, even when every system was designed to prevent them. And finally, Clara's feast reminds us that power is complicated. It's not always obvious who has it. Clara was legally powerless, but in that moment, organizing that feast, she had a kind of power her owner couldn't match. She controlled what people would remember about that night, and what they remembered was her. What do you think Clara's feast really represented? Was it survival, finding a way to make the best of a horrible situation? Was it resistance, a way of fighting back against a system that tried to crush her? Or was it something else entirely? Drop your thoughts below, because I genuinely want to know how you see this story. Clara's feast happened one night in 1859, but its legacy lived on. It became a story that people couldn't forget. A reminder that even in the darkest systems, people found ways to shine. We don't know what happened to Clara after that night. The historical record goes quiet. But for one evening, she created something so beautiful and so perfect that it challenged everything people thought they knew about slavery, race, and power. And more than 150 years later, we're still talking about it. That's power. Real power. The kind that history can't erase. Hit subscribe for more untold stories from American history.